You're in the shade, yet we can't stop ourselves from going out and getting burned. It's as if the notion is who and what you are is not only already enough, but that natural state is the most it will ever be. We are back with another reflection on the Daily Vedantic. And today's reflection is on a quote that I think about quite often from Ramana Maharshi. So if you've heard in these episodes a bunch of Ramas, Ramanas, Ravanas, I'll give you the breakdown. There's only a few of them. They are quite separate, but it's a non-dual philosophy. So you can actually just attribute them all to the same source if you want. And it would honestly be almost as if there's no difference in general. But it could be helpful to give a breakdown of each. So I've mentioned Ramana Maharshi on this episode. He's a sage from 30s, 40s, 50s. That's in the 20th century. Beautiful soul, quite famous. And he walked around a hill for 30 years, silent for like 17 of them. And people just started to love that this guy was walking around so self-satisfied. And then when he started to speak, they were like, oh my goodness, this guy's got it. Then there's also Ram Dass, who is the Harvard-trained psychologist. There's an Indian Ram Dass, but this one that I've mentioned in episodes, the Harvard-trained psychologist that then kind of transcended the need for, he was a big part of the beginning of the psychedelic movement in the 60s, got fired from Harvard, 7-8 years later, transcended a lot of the need for psychedelic escapes and started to talk about deeper philosophical truths that he discovered in his time in India and became known for that after being a prominent Harvard professor, then a firebrand psychedelics leader, and then and vocal speaker, and then kind of settling into I'd say his most profound role, which is on the philosophical side of things. I've also mentioned Ramatirtha. Ramatirtha, he's a sage that passed away at age 33. He came and spoke in the U.S. at the beginning of the 20th century, so 1902, 1903. Never wrote a book, but many of his speeches were translated into multiple languages around the world, and actually died in the Ganges and the Ganga while working on his book. And Swamiji loves Ramatirtha. So there's 3 of these Rams. Then to round it out, there's Rama, who's the main character, Lord Rama, the prince and rightful king, and the Ramayana, one of the 2 major, and your eyes might be glossing over right now, and I know that might be the case because I may have lost many of you. But for the 2 of you that have kept up with this, I'll finish this list. The Ramayana is one of the 2 major epics in Indian history. The Mahabharata, which the main sage is Krishna, and then you have the Ramayana. Some people pronounce it Ramayana, but it's pronounced Ramayana. And that is led by the sage, the exemplary sage of what Lord Rama does in all of these fantastical, dramatic situations. If things were not already confusing enough, the main antagonist in the Ramayana is Ravana, who's a bad guy. Some people interpret some of his things as maybe divinely, logistically helpful to right the world, but most scholars also just simply see him as a bad guy. Anyhow, that is the coverage of many of the Ramas. Ram means God. So that's why I say you could, honestly, in this non-dualistic philosophical podcast, you can take them all as coming from same source, except for the Ravana guy. So Ramana Maharshi has this quote that I've been thinking about for weeks and weeks lately, and that is, he said, "My child, why do you leave the shade and go out and get burned?" This is not nudging people to be complacent, to just sit in the shade. This is more for the ears of the person that keeps getting burned and wondering why. And these words ring so true for me when I get caught up in a scenario where I feel that inner chaos we talked about recently. Or I put myself in a scenario where I feel like the walls are closing in, or the entourage effect I touched on, where basically 6 out of the 8 seasons are the main actor the main character and his friends buying a house that they can't afford based on a verbal agreement of some, and I am talking about the HBO show Entourage, based on some verbal agreement that they're going to make some big movie, some big studio movie around him, but it's just verbal agreement. They haven't signed it. And he goes out and buys a $10 million house. And now they don't know if he's actually going to get the role. And an entire 14 episode season of drama ensues. From leaving the shade of maybe a perfectly satisfying domicile and signing on a dotted line for a house you can't afford. And all of the incarnations of that can take place in our daily lives, where we buy something that we just can't spiritually, financially, relationally afford. Putting ourselves in these positions where we get burned. Taking on too much, overcommitting, frustrated, disappointing people around us, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, even if our better nature was so loud in our heads of, no, don't do that. We go out and we get burned. My child, why do you leave the shade and go and get burned? These words talk about burned. They are singed in the back of my brain, it feels like, because it's so hard to think that we are in the shade. The Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, says 365 times, one for every day, do not fear. It's the most proclaimed, but one of the least famous commandments of the Bible. Do not fear. Christ said, be not worried for the morrow. God is providing for all of the lilies, the birds, the animals, and yet we walk around thinking, no one's going to provide for me unless I'm looking out for number one. Ramana's words echo in this spirit that we are in the shade by default. And the illusion is that we aren't. That we need to go out, get more, accumulate more, or else we won't be all right. It's such an American thing to just almost recoil when anyone tells you to rest. So how can you get more if you're resting? I had a friend recently ask me, is it okay to make music? And he was asking because of Open State and released a bunch of music lately. And he was asking, is it okay to make music if I'm in the early stages of building my company? Because Magic Mind's now 5 years in and a bit more established. And he was asking about his company that he's a year into and asking if it was okay if he can drum, spend time drumming or making music. And I not only reference the episode where I talk about the fact that this is a Yoga for Your Intellect episode, the other philosophical podcast that I co-host with my teacher, Joseph. And in that episode, maybe a week ago, talk about Swami's words of how critical it is to do that which stirs you without some commercial end goal or outcome or thoughts of the fruits of your labor, but do it because it stirs you. And like a lamp, everyone will benefit from letting it come through you, letting that light come through you, whether the lamp gets paid for it or not. It sheds light, it illuminates all of this area just by letting that electricity come through you. And so what I told the friend was, I said, "Did you sleep last night?" He said, "Yeah." I said, No, man, you can't do that. Dude, you're in the first year of building a startup. You can't sleep. Sleeping, how is that moving your numbers forward? Building traction for your business. And yet that is an immutable law that, like gravity, we cannot escape. We do need sleep. Even though our culture will kind of gloss over the fact that we need sleep. That progress is also a function of sleep and rest as much as it is of movement and direction. Similarly, in that same area code, it's almost like we recoil if you tell someone to rest, because that seems antithetical to progress. So back to this phrase, you're in the shade. Yet we can't stop ourselves from going out and getting burned. It's as if the notion is who and what you are is not only already enough. Who you really are, not who you think you are, but who you really are is not only already enough, but that natural state is the most it will ever be. And just the thought, the compulsion that it needs to be more, that's what makes us feel like it's less. It's what burns us, sets us back. Again, I'm not making a claim that you should be motionless, complacent, not act. Action is the insignia of life. Act. But act from a place of self-satisfaction. This philosophy tells us over and over again to act from a place of fullness, self-satisfaction, not from a place of fear. That you need to get more or else you won't have enough. Act from a place of knowing you already have enough, and that's why you should act. Because those around you might not know that they have enough. Because when we act from a place of fear, we undercut our action itself. Try to hit a target from 20 feet away with a whole lot of fear running through you. A whole lot of cortisol, hand shaking. It's not going to add to your efforts. It's going to undermine your efforts. Aim at a target from 20 feet away, from 20 years away, from a place of fullness, from a place of generosity. I'm going to do this, not because I need more, but because I can offer this to others. That is divine alignment with what the lighthouses have told us about ourselves over and over and over again. And even more, that's what underscores. But what's more is that's what amplifies our action instead of undermining it. So if you find yourself getting burned over and over again, and maybe this is my own projection based on my journey of thinking, I should go out and get more. Ambitiously, I'm not doing enough. Maybe try on a different hat, a hat of, all right, enough is as good as a feast. I have enough. This is as good as any feast I could have. I'm going to remain in the shade and let life, energy come through me in whatever form it takes. Maybe it's to make music, to make art, to be the best accountant possible, because you realize I don't need to go out and do anything else than this thing that, well, I naturally seem to be wired for, and people keep asking it of me. Full-time parent. Maybe it is starting that thing that could become a big company, but not from a place of insecurity and fear, but from a place of duty, responsibility, and inner satisfaction. That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.